Hello, everyone. It's Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is September 17th, 2022. Click on the subscribe button here in the lower right to subscribe to future episodes. And also, if you click that notification bell in the far upper right, a Yankee historian will die, somebody anonymous and we don't know. And with that, let me go ahead and get started on my topic for today, which is how import tariffs injure export industries. Most historians who teach the Civil War and Reconstruction era dismiss Southern complaints about tariffs. They argue that the only impact of the tariffs was to raise the price of domestic goods protected by such tariffs for all Americans, not just Southerners. Although most will concede that the domestic producers protected by such tariffs were predominantly outside the South, few of these historians ever explain how protective tariffs are specifically and discriminatorily injurious to export industries. Either they don't explain it because they don't know, or they don't want their students to learn how the South's economy was primarily an export economy, discriminatorily impacted by America's protective tariffs. On the eve of the Civil War, cotton and tobacco alone, those two items alone, accounted for 2/3 of America's aggregate $316 million worth of exports. And cotton represented 92% of that 2/3. 8 years after the Civil War had ended in 1873, the year 1873, cotton and tobacco represented half of all USA exports, with cotton accounting for 90% of that half. So that in 1873, that was 8 years after the Civil War had ended, and we're well into the Reconstruction period at that time. During the 19th century, Great Britain was America's prime trading partner. They typically sold us manufactured goods, which we paid for by selling cotton and tobacco exports to them. Shortly after the Civil War started, America raised her average tariff on dutiable items to 45%. Moreover, at the behest of the states north and west of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line, we kept them at 45% for 50 years. It wasn't until 1913 that they came down. The key point that historians generally don't teach their students is how a 45% tariff depressed the price and/or quantity of Great Britain's purchases of cotton and tobacco from America, which the following example should illustrate. Assume that Britain sends $300 million in manufactured goods to America in one massive fleet at one time. If there is no tariff, the shipper, meaning Great Britain, collects $300 million in proceeds by selling their goods to American importers. The shipper, again, Great Britain, thereby has $300 million in U.S. currency with which to buy American exports and to load into the hulls of his empty ships sitting at an American port, presumably New York. Now, consider the same transaction when a 45% import tariff is imposed upon British goods at the port of New York, for example. Instead of collecting $300 million, the shipper, meaning Great Britain, must pay $135 million to the federal government as an import tax, thereby leaving the shipper only $165 million in American currency with which to buy USA exports. For example, cotton and tobacco, principally cotton. Now, to buy the same quantity of American exports, the shipper, Great Britain, must reduce their bid price to the American seller by 45%. Since Southern farmers were consistently such sellers well into the 20th century, they were forced to accept prices that were far below what a tariff-free market would provide. In fact, they were almost 50% below, which means that if without a tariff, they could have gotten twice as much for their cotton. They would have been twice, their income would have been twice as high. In short, Southerners not only had to pay the same inflated prices for Northern-made manufactured goods that were protected from overseas competition by deterrence tariffs, as did all Americans. Now, all Americans had to pay those higher prices, but the Southerners were uniquely compelled to accept steeply lower prices for their export products. The effect was a regional discriminatory penalty that kept the South poor for a century after the Civil War had ended. Regions that chiefly produced goods for domestic consumption escaped that penalty. Now, this is a pretty simple example of what happened, but I'm willing to bet good money that few of my viewers and few of the so-called students of the Civil War are aware of this. Okay, so let me share with you something that will help you learn this kind of stuff. This is my book, U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency. It's $22 at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you'd like to get an autographed copy from me, it's $26. I'll cover the postage. Just email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Lee at me. Well, Lee is spelled L-E-I-G-H at me, M-E.com. Now, this is the Reconstruction. Grant's presidency covers much of the Reconstruction era as it is officially known. And if you want to know how bad a deal it was for the South, U.S. Grant's failed presidency will tell you. It's also going to disclose a lot of corruption in his presidency that really didn't have anything that didn't really have that much to do with Reconstruction per se, but set a bad example concerning the moralities of leadership at the time. Grant set a bad moral example for leadership, and as a consequence, that filters downstream to the carpetbag regimes in the South and everywhere in the country. So Grant, who is increasingly praised by modern biographers, needs to be given a more sober look. And I recommend each of you please take a good look at Grant's failed presidency, buy the book, read it, learn what's in there, so that you'll be in a position to defend Confederate monuments in the future. Okay, that is my talk for today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.